Let me tell you about a 14-year-old boy who was wrongly executed for murder in 1944. His name was George Sidney, and 70 years after he was railroaded through a sham trial with no real defense, his conviction was overturned, technically vacated on December 14, 2014. And as of Christmas Eve, the state solicitor in South Carolina chose not to appeal that decision. Of course, this happened a long time ago, but this story is important to me personally because I grew up in South Carolina. I went to middle and high school there, and of course things have gotten better in 70 years, but I could see the remnants of the discrimination that was embedded in society. You know, some people are still stuck in old ways of thinking, then it leads to improvements, but there's no magic wand. So, based off the personal experiences growing up and what I witnessed, this story sends chills down my spine. When I was in high school, I carried a book bag bigger than this child. He weighed 90 pounds. George Sidney was the youngest person executed in the U.S. in the 20th century. On March 23rd, 1944, in Alcaloo, South Carolina, 11-year-old Betty June Binnicker and 8-year-old Mary Emma Thames passed George and his sister Catherine while they were looking for flowers. I believe they called them passion flowers or something like that. At the time, the city was separated by a railroad track, pretty much white side, black side, and George's house was right on that railroad. They did not return from their search for the flowers. Their bodies were found the next morning in a ditch. I believe within 24 hours, if I remember right, George was arrested on suspicion of murder. Following his arrest, his father was fired from his job, and his whole family was forced to flee because they were all threatened with lynching, leaving George completely helpless. He later went to trial, which took just one day, including jury selection. The testimony in that trial lasted just 2.5 hours. The court appointed a white tax commissioner campaigning for a local office who had never been involved in a criminal case as a defense attorney. Now you have to think about that at the time. When you are in an area which only white people are allowed to vote, you may find that if you're campaigning for office, if you were involved in the defending a black child in 1944, your campaign would take a nosedive. So he called no witnesses except George. There were no witnesses against Stinney except for the 3 police officers who testified that Stinney confessed. There was no written record of that confession. They just said, take our word for it. The jury took just 10 minutes to find him guilty. There was no real defense, no appeal was filed on his behalf, and he was executed just 2 months later. The entire process from the time the murders occurred until Stinney's execution was 81 days. Less than 3 months had passed between the murders and them being able to make a decision and the execution of that child. Essentially, nobody in a position of power to do anything about it gave it a second thought for almost a century. In 2004, local historian George Frierson, I'm not exactly sure how you pronounce that name, he did some digging and found that a prominent local white family in the area said a member of their family had made a deathbed confession to the murders, and another member of that same family back in 1944 had been a part of the process that colluded to scapegoat George. This began the process which led to the case being reopened and the conviction being vacated, this historian. I'm going to show you a picture of George on the way to the electric chair. This frail child carried a Bible with him under his arm, and he was so small that he couldn't fit in the electric chair, so the executioners made him use the Bible as a booster seat. Now to me, this 90-pound child, when you look at him, there's no way he bludgeoned 2 girls to death. He could not have been strong enough to do that. Because you'd have to think at least one of the girls would run away from this 90-pound child. There's no way he could subdue both of them at the same time. It's just incredibly unrealistic. Our country may have gotten better in the last 70 years, but it still has a long way to go.